That's really not a thing anymore. And in our country and in the world, that's the number of people who spend time outside is dramatically decreasing. And we think at Billion Oyster Project that in order to continue existing on this planet, working, playing, teaching, and learning, there needs to be a fundamental shift in how we interact with the natural world. And we see direct engagement in an environmental restoration project as a way to do that in one of the biggest cities in the world, right? 30 million people live around the Hudson Raritan Estuary, or New York Harbor, and those 30 million people do not interact with the natural world as much as they should. Last question for the audience. I want you all to think about something you're good at and have, pride about, a skill that you have that you developed over your life that you feel good about. I'm gonna give you 5 seconds. Think about that. And I suspect that for many of you, those skills were not developed because somebody told you about them or somebody taught them to you, but rather those skills are developed because you see an outcome that you want to achieve and develop the skills and competencies necessary to get there. Whether you're an oyster farmer, restaurateur, any of those things, that active learning, an actively engaged mind is such an easier thing to teach. And when I started working at Billion Oyster Project, I was never a very successful student. I never thought that I would be good at writing grant proposals or figuring out insurance requirements or anything like that. But as soon as those barriers became, those learnings became things that I could learn to affect the change that I wanted to see, all of a sudden I was writing these big papers and figuring out insurance requirements or whatever else it was. And that's also a fundamental part of Billion Oyster Project, is saying that we have this really big, hard problem we're trying to figure out. How to restore New York Harbor. How are we going to do that? I don't know. Please help us. Help us figure this out, to everyone in New York City, right? So I'm going to give a little background on New York City, New York Harbor, what happened, where we are now, and then talk a little bit about what we're doing to make it better. And as a word of warning, my internal clock is not that great, so Bill, feel free to chase me off the stage, and if I finish early, we'll have some time for questions. Okay. So New York Harbor is an estuary, right? Hudson River flowing down into the harbor. It's an amazing natural port. And when Europeans first arrived in New York Harbor, there were so many fish that they could catch them just by lowering a basket over the side of the boat and bringing it back up. There are accounts of early explorers saying, we'll never need to go to Sweden again for fish. There's more fish here than we could ever eat. Of course, that wasn't true. But the backbone of that ecosystem, like it is in many temperate estuaries in the world, was oyster reefs. And those oysters, as you all know, provided food and habitat for hundreds of different species, stabilized the bottom, filtered the water, and protected the shore from storm waves and things like that. We don't hear about temperate estuaries as places to preserve and protect like we hear about coral reefs and tropical rainforests. Temperate estuaries are the most productive ecosystems on the earth, more biomass per cubic meter than any other ecosystem. I think that we don't hear about them as much because, one, the fish are not as brightly colored as they are in other places, and two, because 22 of the largest 30 cities in the world are built on temperate estuaries. So these places provide an abundance of animal protein, a natural port, and that's why all the biggest cities in the world exist on them and why we don't think of them as areas to preserve and protect. It took about 100 years for New Yorkers to eat all the oysters in New York Harbor. There's estimates that there were 300 square miles of oyster reef before Europeans arrived, and in about 100 years we had eaten them all. So here you see oyster carts and giant piles of shell. And then after that, from the late 1700s through about 1950, the rivers and bays in New York Harbor were used primarily as a system of waste conveyance rather than a natural ecosystem where they were. So these are barges of trash taken offshore into the harbor and people just working to shovel the trash into the water. As the city grew, it ran out of fresh water. All of the fresh water in New York came from a pond in Manhattan. It's what's called Collect Pond. It's right where City Hall is now. And that water became so polluted that the horses in New York City refused to drink it. And about that time, New Yorkers thought it was important to find another freshwater source. So they built the aqueduct, sort of mid-1800s. The Croton Aqueduct system is a a man-made marvel, brings fresh water down from the Catskills down into New York City. And in the late 1800s, New Yorkers had as much fresh water as they wanted. So they took as many baths, showers, washed as many dishes, and flushed as many toilets. And all of that wastewater went right out into the harbor, right onto the oyster beds. It came as a huge surprise to New Yorkers around that time that pouring raw sewage on your food supply was a problem. The people got sick, typhoid and cholera outbreaks broke out, and the oysters were blamed, of course, and not the wastewater treatment system. And so all the beds were closed down in the early 1900s. And that takes us sort of to today. Today, the water in New York Harbor is much cleaner than it was. It's technically swimmable and fishable by EPA standards most days of the year. So if it was a beach, it would be open. But most people don't think of New York Harbor that way. The entire city for 100 years has kind of turned its back on the harbor and sees the harbor as a place that's sort of toxic and polluted. And so our mission at Billion Oyster Project is to basically to restore oyster reefs to New York Harbor through public education initiatives. But what we're actually trying to do is to change the relationship that the city has with the natural resource. And as I mentioned earlier, we think the best way to do that is actively engaging young people in restoring the natural environment where they live. And so this is a map showing our mid to large scale reef sites. Each one of these dots represents between a few 100,000 and a few million oysters spread throughout the harbor. New York Harbor is pretty big, so we're based on Governor's Island right here in the middle, but it takes, it's a 20 to 25 mile boat ride to some of our sites spread out all around, so it's pretty spread out. And we base our sites based on primarily where we can get funding to put oysters in the water, which is not necessarily the best way to restore a landscape, but it's what we're limited to. So we get New Yorkers involved with restoring oysters by first collecting shells from restaurants. We collect shells from about 80 restaurants in Brooklyn and Manhattan and get about 10 tons of shell per week out of the waste stream and out to Governor's Island. New York City generates 35 tons of spent oyster shells every week. We're able to get 10 tons of that. The other 25 tons gets put in black plastic bags, thrown on dump trucks, and driven to Point South to be landfilled. And that's a problem as far as we're concerned. We need those oysters, but it's hard to get them out of the waste stream. There's no other source for oyster shell in the Northeast besides restaurants, because the market is entirely dominated by the half-shell market. So those oysters go to restaurants as whole animals. And this is a way not only to get the shells, but also to involve a whole new group of New Yorkers, diners at restaurants, in the idea of restoring oysters. And Brian and Jesse and the folks at Kimball House know what that's all about with their shell collection program also. Next thing we do is we work with the New York Harbor School. So I'm a former teacher at Harbor School. I taught the aquaculture program. Harbor School is a small marine-themed public high school located on Governor's Island. And students at Harbor School specialize in marine fields. They do all of their normal science, math, social studies, English language arts classes, but then they specialize in marine fields. And we design our restoration projects to leverage the skills that Harbor School students are learning in their classes. And this is also how we get kids outside, right? So Clark and Benai here spent the last 3 years growing these oysters, and now they're putting them down on a reef at the mouth of the Bronx River. Same thing here. We're harvesting oysters from one of our nursery sites to bring them out, bring them out onto a reef site. So in addition to aquaculture, students are learning professional scuba diving, and most of our reef sites are far enough from shore and far enough underwater that they require scuba divers to access. So we rely on teenagers to do the underwater construction and monitoring of the reef sites. Students in the welding program build our reef structures. And because we have a welding program, we build our reefs out of steel boxes, because then the students can play a role in building those reef structures. And we use the oyster restoration as a way to fund the welding program. So we'll get an order for a certain number of reef structures for a grant we're working on or a partnership, and we'll use that funding to hire a welding instructor, welding tables, welding equipment, and all the raw materials we need. Students in the aquaculture program operate a full-time hatchery on Governor's Island. We produce between 5 and 15 million 2-millimeter seeds set on shells every year, and that's all done by teenagers with some support from professional staff at our location on Governor's Island. The Marine Biology and Research Program does scientific monitoring on our reef sites. So they're looking at growth and survival, disease prevalence, the presence or absence of other species in the water, how long the oysters survive, and the direct effect of the reefs on water quality and biodiversity around the site. Students in the Vessel Operations Program drive the boats. I'd like to say if you want to teach responsibility or self-reliance or self-confidence, put a 15-year-old at the helm of a research vessel and have them navigate to a reef they can't see from the surface and keep their friends safe while they scuba dive under the boat. That's a lesson you can't teach without that narrative. Everyone can learn to drive a boat from one dock to another dock, but operating a vessel at an oyster farm or an oyster restoration site is the best way to learn how to drive a boat, right? Here are some students in the welding program standing on their cages that are getting ready to be deployed. We've started to think more about scale. This is one of our larger installations where we have several hundred yards of oyster shell, clam shell, and crushed porcelain going down on the bottom. And gradually, as we gain momentum and move the conversation forward, we're able to think at a larger scale. We've exported the lessons of Harbor School to schools all over New York City through essentially an oyster gardening program where we have oyster research stations, a small wire box filled with oysters and other science equipment that goes at a site near your school, and students at schools around the city come out of the classroom down to the water's edge to pull the cages up, see the animals that are in there, and monitor the cages. All of that data goes online through a digital platform. So students in the Bronx can compare their oyster growth and survival data with students in Staten Island and start to design research projects around that. So through this program, about 5,000 students per year interact with oysters in the natural environment in a new way. Most recently, this past season in New York, we saw more natural recruitment than we've ever seen. Different than probably all of your experience with oysters in the natural environment. In New York Harbor, there really aren't natural oysters. So this is a huge deal. This is one of our oyster research stations on the west side of Manhattan. That's natural set on a plastic tag. So this is a total game changer for us that now we're seeing some recruitment and some larvae in the water and starting to do it that way. So that's it for me. I thought I had one more slide. Thank you all so much. Okay, well, let's go back one then. So the question is, Harbor School is a Department of Ed school. It was the Mayor Bloomberg in New York City had an initiative to break up all the large failing schools and to start smaller themed schools. So Harbor School started in 2003. I was not part of starting the school. I started as a teacher in the school and started the aquaculture program. But it's a lot of how we think about our programs and curriculum and things like that are to fit them into schools that already exist. Like, we want to develop curriculum that science teachers want to use, and that because science teachers are paid to deliver their lessons every day to their 150 students, we want to give them something that's a sort of better option for teaching. Great question. So the porcelain. So we have a name for that project that I'm not comfortable saying in front of the group. But the porcelain is from toilets because the New York City Department of Environmental Protection had an initiative to change all the high-flow toilets in public schools to low-flow toilets. And because there are 1,700 public schools in New York City, they now have warehouses full of high-flow toilets that they crush up, put out in the sun, and then we can use them for our reef base. It's a great question and one that we get a lot, and the question is when can you eat the oysters, or when will we think about using this as the oysters as a revenue stream for what we're trying to do. I said that the water in New York Harbor is swimmable and fishable most days of the year. The reason I said most days is because every time it rains, hundreds of millions of gallons of untreated household wastewater goes right into the harbor. And so as long as that's happening, the waters will be closed to shellfishing. And the way we think about it is that there are places where it makes sense to have oyster farms and edible oysters coming out of, and places where it doesn't make sense to ever eat the oysters from. And we think our oysters in New York Harbor have a more important job to do as part of the ecosystem, and then we'll leave it to you all, people out on Long Island and further from the source of those pollutants, to grow eating oysters. So where are we going in the future? I think we have so much more work to do in New York City. It's such a big system that a billion oysters isn't anywhere near enough to fundamentally change that. So we have a lot more work to do. But I think more importantly, motivating a city around the restoration of a keystone species in the natural environment is something that's, we're creating a model that can exist anywhere where people live on or near a degraded natural system, which is anywhere that people live, right? So you guys should start one down here, Billion Oyster Project.
Thank you, Pete. Appreciate it.